Jekyll Island is located off the coast of the U.S. state of Georgia and is currently run by a self-sustaining, self-governing body. While it is owned by the state of Georgia since 1947, before that, much of its land was privately owned, beginning in the colonial era, with secretive events that took place on the island during the early 20th century being central to today's episode. At the end of November 1910, some of the most influential men in America gathered on Jekyll Island for a secret meeting. Their names were Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, who was the leader of the Republican Party, Adam P. Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, Frank Arthur Vanderclip, who was President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, who was also a prominent banker, Benjamin Strong, who was another important banker, and Paul Walberg, who, you guessed it, was another influential banker. The purpose of the secret meeting was to plan the country's monetary policy and establish a central banking system, which resulted in the draft legislation for what eventually became the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Of course, there's a gap there from when the meeting took place in 1910 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, which I'll get into. But first, allow me to briefly define what the Federal Reserve is. Although it has the word federal in it, which by definition implies it has something to do with the central government, in reality, it is the name of a group of private banks owned by private citizens such as the Rothschild banking family that prints currency, then loans this paper currency to the United States on interest. So rather than the US government printing its own currency backed by gold or silver, as stated in the US Constitution, this legislation made it so instead the US borrows paper printed by a group of private bankers that collect interest on every dollar printed, backed by nothing. This ability to print and loan money on interest is what financed both world wars, drowning the nation in debt, and why $1 in 1913 is equal to $25 today.
So in effect, we're financing our trade with China, trade with Japan by our Federal Reserve currency, which is neither federal, it's not federal any more than the Federal Express Company is a federal company. And it has no reserves because it doesn't need any reserves because it prints its own currency. If you can print your own money, what do you need of reserves? You just go and warm up the printing press and turn out another $10 billion. So, and finally, it's not a system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's not federal. It has no reserves. And it's not a system, but I'm the only person in the world who's ever defined it in my works as a criminal syndicate. And that's what it is. It's a criminal syndicate, just like the mafia, which is one of its subsidiaries, and the CIA and all of the criminal syndicates work out of the Federal Reserve System. Because that's what a Federal Reserve System is. A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless. And I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
Most intelligent people might think that this system is not only unconstitutional, but is unwise, resembling a Ponzi scheme, and designed to make a small group of bankers extremely wealthy at the expense of the working middle class, which gets stuck with inflation and debt. You might also think that surely there must be some sort of opposition to this financial corruption. What about them? This brings us back to those critical years, between the secret Jekyll Island meeting of 1910 and 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law. To understand what happened to the opposition to the central bankers, we need to take a look at a man named J.P. Morgan, an American financier and banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street during the late 1800s, when he was a driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States, spearheading the formation of several prominent multinational corporations, including U.S. Steel Corporation and General Electric, with controlling interests in AT&T, Western Union, and 24 railroads. J.P. Morgan funded and built the Titanic, as well as its sister ship called the Olympia. While there's much written on theories involving an insurance scam, where the damaged twin ship Olympia was really the ship that sank, in an effort to collect insurance money on an already partially damaged vessel. I won't be addressing that conspiracy theory at this time, but there are several interesting videos by others available online for those interested. Instead, I'd like to focus on the fact that J.P. Morgan was booked on the maiden voyage but canceled the day before. The same fortunate outcome cannot be said for the most wealthy and influential opponents to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, American millionaires who did not owe their fortunes to banking, such as Jacob Astor, one of the richest people in the world at the time, whose wealth in today's money was the equivalent of $2.25 billion, whose fortune was built in real estate, inheritance from fur trading, and as an inventor, incidentally a friend of Nikola Tesla, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War. Another opponent to the Federal Reserve Act on board was Benjamin Guggenheim, son of a wealthy miner, who again was not a banker, and either was Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department store, who, like the other successful non-banker businessman I just named, seemed too unlucky or too unable to seem to make it aboard a life raft, and instead died going down with the ship. It's interesting to note that there were no red flares on board to signal any boats for rescue, only white flares that signal a party or that everything's okay. Yet these wealthy and politically influential men opposed to the Federal Reserve were invited aboard the Titanic for its maiden voyage, the same trip that J.P. Morgan conveniently decided to back out from at the last minute, with no Rockefellers and no Rothschilds on board, all major opposition perishing aboard the ship in 1912, with the Federal Reserve Act established the following year during the holiday season, passed through Congress when most were not even present.
Paul Warburg himself, who was the author of the act, and the other bankers had to, for the first time in their life, come down to Washington and lobby in the halls of Congress to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. And of course, they had to make a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, a lot of bribes. But since they printed the money, it didn't matter. So they bribed the Congress to enact the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed, but they still could not get a majority vote. So they had to wait till the Christmas vacation, after Lindbergh and the Middle Western and Western congressmen had departed for Christmas vacation. Then they brought the Federal Reserve Act before Congress on December 23rd, after the opposition had left. But they still had a quorum, they still could pass it. And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud, was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they had a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the
Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations, so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable. It's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around and they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course there's total silence. Nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything that's done in Washington is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans. These are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States, just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you. They have no allegiance to Canada. They're part of the international elite. But of course they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government of robbery. So you have what you call the new economy in the United States, and probably Canada too. And the new economy is simply people working and creating and producing in spite of everything the robbers can do to them. Everything that's accomplished in this country is accomplished in spite of the foundations, in spite of the bankers. People have to work harder to pay the interest, but they do that. They rise to the challenge. At some point, the people will have to make themselves recognized. And they're doing this through the internet. The big question mark is the internet. And that's why Washington has been making frantic efforts to control the internet.
My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. You can find my published books on Amazon. They make a great gift. Thank you to those who support me on Patreon. There should be a link below. Kindly share this video if you found it informative, and please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification bell to receive updates. I look forward to reading your thoughts in the comment section. Have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon.